Okay, so as you may know, uh, being hands-on to me is pretty fundamental to photography because photography is one of those things that you can read about it. There's lots to read about. You can watch videos about it and all those other things. But if you're not actually picking up a camera and taking photographs, then the chances of you improving your photography are probably pretty remote. So what I thought I'd do in this podcast is to just run through 10 tips that can improve your photography right now. And in fact, what I'm doing, I suppose I'm cheating a little bit because this is a PDF download you can get from my website. So if you haven't come across it before, do please have a look at the website. You will find it under a tab which I believe says Improve Your Photography. And there are a few things there. There's free resources that you can make use of because I am, as I've spoken about before, I love my photography. That's why I've been doing it so long. And there are various aspects to that. And I'm really keen that other people get as much from their photography as they can as well. So that's why these resources are available. So I'm going to run through the 10 things that get spoken about in this PDF. You're welcome to download the PDF, as I've already said, and I'll put the link in in fact, the link is already in the description, I believe, but I'll make sure it's there. So the very first one is to make sure that you have a clear subject. So this might seem fairly obvious, but it isn't to everybody. And what I should say as well is that these 10 things, I'm sure that at least some of them you're doing already. So I'm not suggesting that everybody is not doing any of these things. However, what I find is that I tend to go down bunny holes occasionally and I start getting really good at one thing. And in so doing, that's great, but I forget some of the other things that I was doing. So that's really the other reason for doing this and suggesting the PDF is that I think it's always good to just step back, go back over the basics again. There is absolutely no harm in doing that. And if you're anything like me, there's probably one or two things that you've either forgotten about or you were doing at one stage and you're not doing them at the moment. So have a clear subject. And the reason for doing that is that, look, obviously photography is subjective, but to me it's really important that you have a clear subject because that's what the photograph's about. And looking at it from the perspective of a viewer, somebody looking at your photograph, what are they supposed to be looking at? And I have, and I've spoken about this before, I know in webinars and workshops and things, I've been asked to look at photographs or comment on them, and they've been really nice, really beautifully exposed, lovely colors, all that kind of thing. But I have absolutely no idea what I'm supposed to be looking at and what the photo's about. So there's nothing wrong with doing something a bit esoteric, a little bit kind of out there. That's great from time to time. But my honest belief is that for most photographs, just the day-to-day stuff, we need to be telling some sort of a story. I talk about the visual storyteller, and I absolutely believe all that stuff. So having a good subject is really important, a clear subject, something that the viewer can connect with, something that gives your photograph some sort of purpose, some reason for being. And so having a clear subject is one of the first things, or one of the first hurdles, if you like, where I find a lot of photographers keel over. So and with this PDF, there are examples, and if you can hear a page turning, that's because I've got one here. Now, the second suggestion is that you use the rule of thirds. Now, you don't have to use the rule of thirds. It's just one of a number of composition techniques you can use. But the advantage of it is that I think most people, when they start out, and I apologize if this isn't you, but I think most people tend to slap their subject. So there they go. They're already doing number one. They've got their subjects and they stick it right in the center of the frame, which, on the one hand is nice if you're doing a kind of documentary type shot or doing a shot for, I don't know, a manual or something like that. That's pretty handy because if you're trying to fix something on your car and you're looking at a photograph, you really don't want something too artistic because you kind of want to get to the point and get it done. However, for other photographs, And I think this is especially true of photographs of people. It's really nice to put them in some sort of a context. And basically the rule of thirds, and it's much easier if you actually look at the PDF download, but there you go. All you're doing is dividing the frame by adding 4 lines. 2 of them are equally spaced horizontal lines. 2 of them are equally spaced vertical lines. And that gives you this very simple grid. And the idea is that you place your subject or the focal point in your subject. So if it's a portrait, I tend to use the eye closest to me. That's where I'll tend to focus on with my focusing. And that's where I tend to kind of construct the frame around that point. So put the focal point on one of the 4 crossings of those lines. So if you think of that grid, you're going to have 4 points in there where lines cross. If that doesn't work, at least put the focal point on one of those 4 lines so that you are creating space. So what that does is it pushes the subject to one side, and then you've got all sorts of other things you can either put into that space or you can leave it completely blank. And what people will do when they look at it, we like to create our own stories, and we don't tend to do this consciously. It tends to be subconscious. But if there's a gap, if there's space there, we'll tend to imagine, things that could be happening or might be about to happen or have just happened, all that kind of stuff. So I'll pitch the courses. I've got the DSLR mirrorless photography course. I talk a lot about, in fact, the smartphone course as well. In both of those, I talk about composition and the use of space, and it's actually a very powerful technique. So if you're finding that your pictures have all of your subjects slap in the middle, do experiment with rule of thirds, and there are others that you can use as well. But just try putting your subject basically off center and just looking and look at the difference it makes visually and how the feel of the photograph changes. And then you can experiment with that. And this is how you start to create photographs that have a real impact. So that was number 2, use the rule of thirds. Number 3 is use depth of field. So this is another one of those things that I think when I was doing photo walks and stuff like that, that's one of the questions that would come up most often. How do you get a sharp subject but an out of focus background? And it's all to do with your use of depth of field. And depth of field is a really powerful tool for guiding the viewer's eye to your subject. You can take them on a little journey through the frame. There's other techniques for doing that. But depth of field is really powerful. And once you understand that, and the bad news is if you're worried about technical things, you do need to get a basic understanding of the exposure triangle, which I've done podcasts on before. So, and in fact, there's quite a lot in the course on that as well. So exposure triangle is one of those things that some people just feel, it's really difficult and stop right there. But the truth is that it's not half as difficult as most people think it is. And once you understand it, you only need a very basic understanding. It's really about a very simple relationship. Once you've got that, you don't need to remember all the numbers. You can just do those as you need to, work them out as you need to. But once you understand the relationship, then all that creative potential of your camera is yours. You have full control. So depth of field, really important in communicating what the photograph is about. It's about really steering the viewer to the part of the photograph that you really want them to be looking at, the most important part of the photograph, which again, if it's portrait, is generally the eyes. And when I'm shooting wildlife, I tend to focus on the eyes of animals, and then I'll put, so I've got pictures of lions and bushes and stuff like that. So I'll just shoot with the depth of field. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Just getting over something. Right. So lion in the bushes. I'll focus on the eye, but then use depth of field to put as much of the bush out of focus as I can, both foreground and background. And that way you can see where the lion is. You've got context, but you know exactly what you're supposed to be looking at. Because I tell you what, even if I'm in a vehicle, certainly if I'm walking and I see a lion in a bush, I'm looking at its eyes. So, because I want to know what it's thinking about and just how hungry it might be. Okay, number 4, know your camera. So again, this is really important. And again, it's one of those things, it's really important, but also it's not half as difficult as you might imagine, because for most most of the time, and I'm going to speak personally here, I don't dive into the menus very often. It's generally if I need to dive into something, it might be checking my batteries, which are charged, how they're doing, all of that kind of stuff. I might be nuking some cards just because I've pulled everything off them and I now just want to reinitialize them and then start again. Those tend to be menu functions. But beyond that, I don't use much. So most of the controls that I tend to use when I'm taking the photographs tend to be the controls on the body of the camera. And this is And again, just for context, I'm using a Canon EOS 5DS and a Canon EOS 7D Mark II. Those two pretty much drive, the controls are almost identical. And the only program control I have is back button focus, which I think I've done a podcast on, but if not, it's definitely in the course. So please check it out. And the only other stuff I tend to use regularly are just the basic menus on the back of the camera. So these are just sort of basic setups, which even then I won't change them that much. Tends to be more things like ISO I'll change through a menu most regularly. And that's only because the light's changing and I need to just modify the exposure so that my shutter speed and aperture are where I want them. So the reason I say know your camera, though, is to practice with this stuff so that you understand where it is. Because if you are, it could be a family event. It could be this holiday of a lifetime where you could be being chased by an animal and you want to get some good photographs of what's about to eat you. But whatever it is, you don't want to be hunting through menus to try and find out how to set things. You need to know how to do that because the pressure's on. You might be taking a shot that's only there for a moment. And that's not the time to start trying to remember which menu you need to dive into. So the regular stuff, get to know that so you don't have to think about it too much. And then the other stuff, you're probably not going to worry about too much. How do you know which are the things that you are going to use most often? Well, you learn that by using the camera a lot. So shoot different subjects. Whatever it is that floats your boat, shoot that. So if it is wildlife and you don't get regular exposure to wildlife, just photograph birds because they're everywhere. And they're quite tricky, actually, to photograph well. So they make really good training subjects. If it's portraits, just grab portraits of people, obviously with their permission when you can. But just practice. That's really the heart of it. Just practice as much as you can. And with that practice, you'll be changing the settings you need to change. And so you'll know which ones those are. And you'll also know exactly where they are. And you'll be, in the end, you'll do it without really thinking about it too much. Okay, number 5 is to use leading lines. So this goes back to composition, where we're guiding the viewer's eye through, take them on a little journey through the photograph. So what are leading lines? Well, essentially they're any line, and I'm going to use that word line fairly loosely, but it's something that when you look at a photograph, it naturally takes you from one part of the photograph, one part of the frame to another. So examples of leading lines could be to use train tracks, for example. So I think we've all seen photographs where somebody stood on some train tracks and just sort of photographed looking down the tracks to something on the horizon, might be a train, but having a look. So your eye is drawn, though, from where the train tracks are really wide, where they're close to you, to as they narrow, and that takes you on that little visual journey to this oncoming train that you want people to see. But there are many others. So you can look at lines of trees, street lights, paving stones, windows. I've got in the PDF, there's an example of one I took on a train somewhere where it's just a row of seats. So there's many examples, and the great thing about leading lines is that once you start thinking about them, you start to see them everywhere, or things you can use to create leading lines. And of course, when you start to incorporate them in your photograph, and you might do that by using the rule of thirds, by the way. So these things do obviously overlap. You can combine multiples together to get really interesting photographs. But once you start to combine these things, then you do start to get much more interesting photographs that certainly for somebody who's viewing the photograph and maybe hasn't seen that subject, they may be seeing it in a different way, or they're getting they're definitely getting a much more interesting photograph than just something sort of slapped in the center of the frame. So that's number 5, use leading lines. Number 6 is to change your point of view. So again, most people, when they take photographs, they'll tend to just take the view they see as they're standing there. The more exciting people will crouch down a little bit, so you've got that lower view, and that's good. But the thing to remember is that there are many other views you can take. So the first one I'm going to talk about is just orientation of the camera itself. And it used to be, before we had smartphones, that most photographs were what we called landscape format. So the widest part is the sort of wide axis, and the shorter bit was the up and down axis, X and Y. Try not to get too technical. So that was fine, but most photographs would be taken landscape. Now that with the advent of mobile phones and smartphones, I should say, and the cameras that they have. So I'm just getting over something, cold or something. I'm having a quick slurp to keep me going. With smartphones, it's become normal to shoot in portrait format. So then the longer axis is the vertical one and the narrower axis is the horizontal one. So it doesn't really matter how you start out, but look at a subject and experiment with both orientations, because that can significantly change the feel of an image just by the way you shoot it. So that's the first thing to experiment with. The second thing, changing your point of view, is to look at other viewpoints, to get right down low. One of the things I like to do when I was doing photo walks, which I would do in Sydney with We're Observers, and I think when I started we were doing them every week, and then it became every 2 weeks, but we tended to be in the same places, or there'd be 2 or 3 different places we would tend to go. And when you're doing it every time, you can get a little bit jaded on occasion. So, or I did anyway, being totally honest about it. And it was great. And I loved it. It was great fun working with people, but I've kind of seen this shot. I've seen this view about, 50 times. So how can I shoot it differently? And the thing that I would tend to do, just to inspire myself really, was just put my camera right on the ground and take a photograph from there. And obviously you can do this with the smartphone too, because if you don't want to use the button on the screen, generally with most smartphones, if you press one of the volume buttons, that will also, when you're in camera mode, that will also take a photograph. So you don't have to be lying on the floor or anything like that. But just try something like that. Get down really low. Look at something the way you wouldn't normally look at it. Or if you can, get a really high viewpoint, so you're looking down on it. Or turn the camera at an angle. How does that turn out? So it comes down to experimenting. And a lot of these things won't work. I mean, that's the nature of experimentation. A lot of it, you just think, oh, that's pretty horrible. But what can happen is you think the actual shot you've just taken isn't that spectacular, but it's just giving you an idea of how you can use what you're looking at. It might be there are leading lines you hadn't noticed, or there's certain ways that the scene is lit that you can get a more interesting take on it by just shooting from a different position. So do try different ways of shooting, shoot from different viewpoints. And often it's more interesting if you shoot from a viewpoint that you wouldn't normally naturally have. So just standing there taking the shot without moving at all is not really going to get you much to get you thinking differently about a subject, if that's your aim. But if you can get down low, get down close, all those sorts of things, try those things out. So there's many ways of shooting differently as you can think of. Now, number 7 is to use reflections, and they're great. So depending on where you are, there are likely to be sources of reflection. The obvious one is water. So if you're near a river or a body of water, I live near a river in France, so there's bridges around. So if the water's fairly flat, there's a place up the road actually, Bergerac, which has a really nice arch bridge, and when quite often the river is relatively smooth going through there, so you get these lovely circles created by the reflection. So look for things like that. But don't forget, you've also got windows. So if you're in a town, you can look for reflections of plate glass windows. and just have a look around, see what's there. And a great tip I got from a colleague of mine, actually, when we were observers, was to take a bottle of water, because in living in Sydney, I'd normally have water with me anyway, just to, keep hydrated. But his suggestion was, and it's a really good one, I've seen this elsewhere, but if you want to use a reflection, but there isn't a source nearby, just get a bottle of water and pour it on the ground and have a look, make sure you're doing it in the right place. But just pour the water on the ground and then get in quickly and take a photograph and use that reflection. So you can bring your own reflective surface pretty much. So that's another good one. And they tend to be very effective at night as well, if you can find a good source of reflections at night. Okay, number 8 is to be aware of the background. So the reason I put this in there is that I've seen people have taken some lovely photographs, and they've clearly been very focused on what their subject is, and they've, thought about getting photographed in exactly the right moment so they get the expression in the subject and all that kind of thing. But what you don't have is to have a great picture of kids, for example, I know, playing around, doing whatever, and that's all perfect, but there's a couple of dogs in the background that are clearly making up after an argument or something. So it's getting rid of the tree growing out of somebody's head issue that is one that I remember from when I first started my photography when I was a kid. That was a common error I used to see other people making, mostly. So this is, again, where the visual storyteller idea comes in. The idea of it is to look at the whole frame. So you're looking at your subject. You're looking at where you're placing your subject within the frame so that you've got some context. You're telling more of a story about your subject. It doesn't have to be a long story, but it's some sort of a story about them. But also you're looking at exactly what is in the background as well. And there are elements usually in the background that you can use. Once you start being aware of everything in the frame, you'll find that there are elements that you can make use of that, again, just add that something else to the photograph so that it becomes a lot more interesting. Okay, number 9. Try using black and white. So I would shoot in color. I was shooting raw. And when I talk about photography, I talk about post-processing as being an essential step in the process, which I believe it is with digital photography. If you grew up with film photography, or if you're getting back into film photography, it's a little bit different. And certainly when I was shooting in film, those decisions were made before I got anywhere near my subject normally, in that I'd have black and white film stock with me or color film stock, and then certain speeds of film and all that kind of thing, because the film itself had its own characteristics. It might be very grainy, it might be very smooth. The color film might have a particular hue. It might lean towards blue, or it might be quite vivid in its use of in the way the colors came out. So film photography is a bit different. And basically, those decisions that we would make as film photographers before a shoot, you can now make post-shoot in post-production. So whether you're using Lightroom, Photoshop, or something else, these are the options that you have available. So occasionally, though, when I photograph, as I say, I always shoot in raw, always shoot in color. But I have taken shots knowing that was going to be a black and white shot, because what I'm looking at, I know from experience of doing it that is going to look pretty nifty in black and white. And the reason that I know that is that I understand the difference between color and black and white. So it might not sound like much, but remember, we see in color. So when we look at a color photograph, that's our normal way of seeing that subject, whatever it is. So it's kind of normal, that's how it is. It's just color. However, when you switch to black and white, that's not how we normally see things. And the emphasis is on slightly different things. So what we tend to see in black and white are shapes and textures. So if you think about it, if you look at a black and white photograph, particularly if you look at something that might be a geometric design that's colorful, The image that popped into my head was the tiles on the Sydney Opera House. But of course, taking a photograph of them in colour and then in black and white isn't that different, because they're pretty much they're kind of a light grey. So there's not much change. But if you think of something that's in colour, like a colour pattern of some sort, maybe of different materials, so some are smooth, some are quite rough, switch that to black and white and you've got a very different image. Equally, and it's something to be aware of, very mindful of actually, if you are photographing people, if you're photographing someone who doesn't have perfect skin, and what I mean by that is they've got like little pits and blemishes and things like that in them, if you switch to black and white, those are likely to be much more obvious than they will be in colour. So switching to black and white does have its issues, but it also can make a scene look very different. And if your aim when you're sharing a photograph is to have people really look at it and maybe see something in that image that they hadn't, it might be a subject they're familiar with, but see something in it that they hadn't noticed before, then using black and white is one quite powerful technique to do that. And something just to add, I suppose, from doing wildlife photography, one of the things that I've noticed when I've, because I experiment a lot with flipping things into black and white just to see what I've got, because that sometimes gives me a much more interesting image, in my opinion, than the colour. But when I look at photographs of animals in the wild in black and white with no kind of human evidence there at all, it's just wildlife in its natural setting. To me, a black and white shot could almost have been shot at any time. It might have been shot last week or 100 years ago. And I guess that's because I associate black and white with earlier photographers, because generally that's all they had available. But that's what I mean about black and white. Can give an image a different meaning if you are kind of tuned into it. So that was number 9. And the final tip is to break the rules. So I've spoken about this in webinars, if you've been on one of my webinars before, but I'm actually a big believer in breaking the rules. But equally, I think it's really important that you understand what rules you're breaking. And the reason for that is simply that way you can replicate what you've already done. And if you can replicate it, that becomes part of your style. It's a choice you can make. Whereas if you're just playing around and you get a result, but you don't know how you got it, that's just luck, really. And where I like to help people get with their photography is to sort of get past the luck stage and be able to look at an image and know how it was shot. So I've given a couple of images in the PDF. One is photographing straight into quite harsh sunlight, and that's using black and white, in fact, and giving a very harsh, contrasty image. And then the second image I've got there is a relatively slow exposure panning in. It was a kind of evening shot on the Car Hill Expressway, actually, in Sydney, which is kind of a little it's full-lane road, runs over the top of the Circular Quay, but it was taken at a time where there's a lot of traffic going one way, not much going the other way, and I just panned with this car. So everything's blurry, everything's moved, but those shots, I think, can be very interesting, and I may have spoken about this in the photograph about what makes a good photograph. I've certainly spoken about it recently in one of the things about what's a good photo. And the reason I mention is that particular evening we were on a photo walk, and we had a group of runners, so some sort of running club. We're running on the pedestrian part of the Car Hill Expressway, which is obviously where we were. And they ran past us, and one of the people in the group turned round as they were running away and took this photograph. And it was all a bit blurry because it was low light. It was evening. The light was dropping off. You've got to kind of keep adjusting your ISO if you want to keep your exposure where you want it and everything else the same. But one of the runners had turned, I think it was a woman, turned her head to look back at us. And I just loved it as a shot, because what we were looking at was a whole load of out of focus stuff, all these bodies that were sort of bouncing up and down through the movement of running. And there was this one face looking back at us. Now, whatever meaning you want to give that is up to you. And that's, another aspect of photography. That's where it becomes art, in my opinion. But I just loved it as a shot, and that was definitely breaking the rules because, was it a good exposure? Not really. Was everything sharp? No, but it did have a good subject, and it was definitely different. So I think the point about this really is the more that you learn about photography, you learn what the rules are. So rule of thirds, leading lines, all these all the things that can lead to a certain composition. You'll know exposure. You know how exposure works on your camera. You'll know how to get the best from your camera. And you should be able to shoot a perfectly exposed shot, nice composition, very clear what the subject is, very good, perhaps eye connection with the subject if it's person or an animal or whatever. But every now and again, it's good to shoot something that's very different and just try things out and all of this evolves into our individual style as a photographer. Does style matter? Probably not really, to be perfectly honest, but it's really up to you. You might want to have a style. Doing what I do with selling my photographs, then I'll tend to stick to a particular style, at least with the images I put on sale, because people who like me and follow my work, so again, that's true of Instagram, where I publish a lot of photographs. They tend to be very similar because the people who follow me on Instagram like those kind of photographs. And I have tried experimenting at different times and putting up photographs I thought were pretty cool, actually. But things I just tried out, might be some urban photography or something like that. And I got very few likes. And that's simply because the people who are following me people like consistency. So that's where style comes in. So if you are doing your photography to sell and you already have a following, then always look after the people who are looking after you if they're buying your work and give them what they want. But also there is room for that alternative collection, the sort of backroom collection that's got your other stuff where you were experimenting and you've come up with other things. And maybe at some point you branch out and create a new following of the new stuff. Okay, so that was the podcast. So 10 simple steps to improve your photography today. They're in the PDF. So just to recap, I suppose, have a clear subject was number 1. Use rule of thirds was number 2. Use depth of field was number 3. Know your camera, number 4. Use leading lines was number 5. Change your point of view, that was number 6. Number 7 was to use reflections. Number 8 was to be aware of your background. Number 9 was to try using black and white, give that a go. And number 10 was to break the rules. So I hope you've found that interesting. If there are things in there you haven't been doing, please give them a go. And as I say, you can download the PDF from the website. So, there's a link in the description. You should be able to get to it through www.ge.photography. And in fact, if you can't, please let me know because it means something's not working. And please let me know if there is anything you would like me to cover in a future podcast. So that's it for now. Enjoy your photography. I'll speak to you in the next podcast. Bye now. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. Now, I just want to say thank you for tuning in and joining me in the Wildlife and Adventure Photography podcast. If you have enjoyed today's episode, please give me a like, a subscribe, maybe tell your friends, and by all means leave a comment. And if there is a subject you would like me to cover in the future, please let me know and I'll be very happy to do my best. So thanks again for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you again next podcast. Bye for now.